scientist. I'm actually a dropout. I've only got standard 10, but after 30 years, Harvard did appoint me as an associate because of the work I've done. So I think, yeah, I had examination anxiety, so I just flunked out and I decided I want to write a book on tracking. And since I matriculated, the idea of applying for a job has just never occurred to me, so yeah. So this is Lone Tree in the Central Kalahari in Botswana. It's back in 1985. Unfortunately, the village don't exist anymore because Trans-Kalahari Highway went straight through the middle of the village with huts both sides, and eventually, people moved off to other villages. This is my old Land Cruiser back in the early 90s. If you want to become a mechanic, you buy yourself a second-hand 1981 Land Cruiser, a workshop manual, spare parts and tools, and you head off into the Central Kalahari alone. Whatever goes wrong, you've got all the time in the world to fix it because you're not going anywhere. So in terms of self-directed learning, I think that's a good start. And that's Ngate sitting on the top with this long stick navigating. That was before GPS. So the jacket with the hat, that's supposed to scare the lions off at night, but this is Ngate and Karawa and Kwasi. This is the beginning of the persistence hunt, which we believe may well go back about 2 million years to the evolution of Homo erectus. There's morphological evidence that Homo erectus were adapted to endurance running. The key question is, why did they have to run? And that was way before bows and arrows or any missile weapons. And it turns out that we as humans, we're hairless, we sweat, we can actually endure extreme heat in the midday, which other mammals simply can't. So we could literally run down animals until they collapse. And that's why, by the way, the only other, conferences are usually quite stuffy, and you have to, if you pitch up barefoot, they won't even listen to you. The only other conference I could go barefoot was the Barefoot Running Conference in London. Anyway, so at the start, the three of them, like Karawa's the younger one, he's the runner, but Kwasi and Ngate, even though they're too old to run the full distance, they work collectively. In the beginning, essentially, they've got to identify that individual kudu by its footprints. So when the kudu runs back into the herd and it runs out of sight, they have to identify that individual animal by its footprints. Otherwise, they keep on running a fresh animal and they'll never get anywhere. So in the beginning, it's really, really tough, and that's why they work as a team. And eventually, this is clips from the BBC video, which you can actually see on our Cybertracker website, which is done by David Attenborough and the Life of Mammals. It's a 7-minute clip. So this time, they're still working as a team, and they usually home in on the males with the heavy horns that tires them out. And then at some point, the others start dropping out, and then by that time, when there's only Karawa running, he's also starting to get tired, but the kudu's also getting tired, so it's kicking up the sand, and you can see from the tracks which is the kudu which is now tired. So when it doubles back into the other herd, you look for the tracks that are kicking up sand, and the stride length gets shorter, so you can actually tell from the tracks which is the animal that's getting tired, and they have to keep on testing themselves against the kudu tracks. Like when I ran the persistence hunt with Ngate in 1990, I was about 30 years old and slightly but more fit than I'm now. I just went hell for leather. They said, no, a white man can't do this, but I have to see it for myself. They said I had these calf-length boots because I was paranoid about puff adders biting me or whatever. But those boots were like lead. But you're so focused on the kudu that you project yourself into the animal, you visualize the animal, and in your imagination, you literally feel like you've become the animal. And the mistake I made is that because of my inexperience, I got so immersed in the kudu that I lost track of my own condition. So by the time I got to the kudu that Ngate had run down at that point, of course, Ngate and we sort of separated in the bush. He was like, you drink your fill of water before you start, and then by the end, we consolidated the water in one water bottle which Ngata was carrying, and he assumed that I'd gone back to the camp. And I assumed that if I get to the kudu, I can drink the stomach water, because I'd done that with gemsbok before, which is a grass feeder. Of course, when I got to the kudu, Ngata said to me, no. Well, firstly, they finished off the water because they thought I'd gone back. I thought, well, can I drink the stomach water? No, the kudu is the only species that feeds on acacia leaves that is toxic for human consumption. So, of course, there was no stomach water. And it's like the gemsbok, it's like a grassy fermented soup. But when you're really, really thirsty, it's actually not too bad. Anyway, so we started walking back, and then as I relaxed, I realized that, I'm really, my legs were shaking, and I was really quite exhausted, and Ngata was watching me. He knew I was finished. And then I realized that it was dry. I'd stopped sweating. And at that point, your body temperature regulation breaks down, and your brain can overheat, and you die very quickly. And so I asked Ngata, are there any tamas, are there any roots? He says, no, it hasn't rained in that part for years. The rainstorms are very patchy in the Kalahari, so you can have one patch where there's been no rain for, say, 7 years, and there are no water. So, so that was my dilemma. I had to, if I pushed myself, I would kill myself. If I just rested in the shade, I would die. So Kayate and Borka stayed with me while Ngate just said, look, he'll get his father to bring me water. No, Ngamkabe had gone back to the camp because he's too old. So he went off at a stiff pace. This is after he ran down the kudu. He then ran back to the camp to get Ngamkabe to backtrack him with water. And of course, Kayate and Natu, they let me rest in the shade, and they watched me, and then they start pushing me, because now the sun was going down, so if I just sat there, if it got dark, Ngamkabe wouldn't find his way, couldn't backtrack to find me, so I would die. So if I pushed myself too fast, I would die. So they would monitor me and gently push me, and it's actually the first time in my life. I was always quite stubbornly independent. I didn't depend on anybody. But at that point, I was totally at the mercy of these hunters to save me. I was completely in their hands. And Ngata actually risked his own life, because by the time he got back to the camp, he was also dry. Because when they give you the water, they say to you, don't drink this, it'll kill you. Because by that time, you lost about 10% of your body weight in water. So if you drink water too fast, the osmosis through your body cells, apparently the red blood cells will collapse and you'll basically die. So you sit there with this water, and you wash your hair and your face to cool your brain, and you just take a little sip of water until you recover over a period of an hour or two. So anyway, that's why Ngate said to me, this is the tip of that kudu's horn, and it's to remind me to think like a tracker or I'll get myself killed. So this is Karawa. At this point, the kudu has collapsed. So the spear is actually not necessary, it'll die. So the spear is really just to make it a quick death. In fact, at this point, when the eyes glaze over, like Kara would say, he has now entered the mind of the kudu, and he now controls the kudu. Because they literally, and this is one of the paradoxes of tracking, is that the tracker literally immerses himself into the mind of the kudu, and in the process, it's that empathetic understanding where you think like the kudu and you feel like the kudu. So you've got the sympathy for this animal, which you then have to kill to feed your family. And this is the Karawa giving his respects. He sort of sprinkles the sand from where the spirit of the kudu came from, and thanking the spirit, who then goes back into the sand for feeding his children. So that's one of the contradictions of tracking, is that in order to track down the animal, you have to understand the animal and empathize with the animal to the point that you really feel like you've become the animal. And you're literally in your own body. I mean, there were fleeting moments where you visualize the tracks, and I literally felt like I could feel the motion of the kudu's body in my own body, and my body was following back there. So it's actually quite a visceral, almost like sort of an out-of-body type of trance-like experience. And it's very visceral. It's not like walking to a supermarket and buying some meat in a plastic bag. So this is Ignite with a bow and arrow. The bow and arrow goes back about 60, 70,000 years. There's very few of them, mainly in Namibia, who still hunt with the bow and arrow. In Botswana, it's now been banned. So Nate passed away last year. I've known him since '85, so I've had a 30-year relationship with him. And unfortunately, the lone tree, the Botswana hunters, is completely banned in Botswana. I've got a shoot-on-sight policy. If they go hunting, they actually get shot by the anti-poaching unit. So it's really quite horrific. This is the little poison larva that they dig out. And this is just children that play. And you'll notice that they're barefoot. There's that little girl in the rough and tumble with a little toddler and the bigger boys, and they're all going for this ball. So there's no, it's like a very, I mean, this is what they do. They play. And that's how they learn. And incidentally, the one thing we all have in common, if a young child goes for a walk on the beach or a walk on a sandy patch and they look at footprints, that is the one thing we all have in common worldwide, and the one thing we still have in common with hunter-gatherers more than 100,000 years ago. Like over the last 10,000 years, we've changed the food we eat, the clothes we wear, our shelters, our medicine, our music, our language have changed. Everything have changed about human culture, except when you look at footprints, you're essentially engaging in the same mental processes that we have done for the last 100,000 years and which we all have in common worldwide. And this is just an article from The Guardian about going barefoot, that not only do children who go to school barefoot, they learn better, they behave better, and they actually show an improvement in academic results. So if you want your kids to do better, lose the shoes. My own theory is that when you track barefoot, you actually feel more alert. You're literally more alert. All your senses are more alert. And then my colleague Dan Liebenberg at Harvard pointed out to me that under the balls of the feet, the concentration of nerve endings is as high as the most sensitive parts of your body, like the tip of your tongue, the tip of your fingertips. The most sensitive parts of your body, you've got the same concentration of nerve endings under the ball of your feet. So when you put shoes on or boots on, you're actually dulling one of your sensory organs. It's like putting a blindfold on or stopping your ears. So, and I've always walked barefoot all my life, and the people in Noordhoek think I'm a little bit odd. But I think wearing shoes is actually a little bit odd, because you're actually depriving yourself of a very important source of sensory stimulation. Which is why I think kids going barefoot actually perform better. There's just two young kids, they learning to hunt, they start hunting like little dung beetles and they lizards, and in the process, like little birds, in the process start to get to know animal behavior from insects right through to the birds and animals. And that knowledge is all part and parcel of what they apply once they become adults. Knowledge of bird tracks, which are feed in the morning. If the bird tracks are on top of the kudu tracks, you know that the kudu was during the night. Or if the kudu is on top of the bird tracks, you know it's late morning. Or if a dung beetle or if a scorpion track goes over the track, scorpion is nocturnal. Or if it's on top of the track. So little tracks all tells you a lot about interpreting the age of tracks when you're hunting the animal. And so if the tracks are too old, there's no use tracking it down. Or if it's very fresh, then you can pursue it. So all of what they learn as children playing and hunting as little games, that's all valuable knowledge, and they learn from each other through child peer review. Now, one of the interesting things about tracking is that when you look at animal tracks and signs, they're incredibly complex. The weathering, the tracks, I mean, you could just see this ground there. It's actually very complex. It's the one thing, by the way, that computers cannot do. Computers are very good at facial recognition, at recognizing patterns and stuff. At this point in time, computers cannot interpret animal tracks. It's too complex. And it took the human mind 2 million years of evolution to learn to do that. But what's really interesting, what I found, is that if you have a group of trackers, say 2, 3, or 4 of them working together, the 3 most experienced trackers make a mistake. And the least experienced younger tracker gets it right. We test them one by one. And then you ask them, okay, go back and discuss it collectively. They come up with the correct answer. So what's really interesting about the sort of master tracker level is that it also requires the humility to recognize when you yourself have made a mistake. And by the way, that applies to me myself when I test them, because at the master tracker level, we're really pushing the limits of human perception. So often I think, okay, I think this is a Cape fox, and David Dum thinks it's a bat-eared fox, and Kui, the most experienced guy, thinks, no, it's a wildcat or whatever, but it's like really complex, and then we start debating it, and I actually discovered, no, but actually David Dum, the least experienced, is actually correct. So in my notebooks, which I do in fountain pen, I will actually cross out where I make a mistake and then credit the one. So you'd often see in my notebooks where I've self-corrected. So tracking involves a process of peer review that is self-correcting. And how it happens is that particularly tracks which are like really, really difficult, where there's no agreement among all of us, like for example, Koma was always trying to test the elder guys. He got this really faint track which he thought was a porcupine. And I looked at it, and old Kui said, no, this is a honey badger. And I looked at it, and David Dum said, no, it's a porcupine. And Kui David said, it's a porcupine. And Kui Kao said, no, this is a honey badger. So I said to Kui Kao, okay, now the two old guys are going to have to fight with the three younger guys. And we had to track this up and down, and about 100 meters further on, about 50 meters on, Koma said, no, here's a track. It's definitely porcupine. I looked at it and said, no, that's honey badger. Just went tracking on, and about more than 100 meters further, they found a track. I said, yeah, okay, this is a honey badger. So it really takes a lot of debating and looking for additional evidence. And it's not just about, it's not an authoritarian process where you decide, okay, I'm right and he's wrong. It doesn't work like that. They will challenge you, and they will argue with you, and they will look for more evidence until we've actually found enough evidence that we can all agree on what it is. And that is the essence of scientific interpretation and peer review at its most basic level. Now, this is a set of caracal tracks that stumped me when I had Stephen Pinker with me in Cape Point. And Stephen is a cognitive psychologist at Harvard, and he's sort of one of the 50 most influential scientists in the world, so I really was a little bit nervous about this. So I showed him this. This is actually his photograph. He's a brilliant photographer. And then the caracal was ambling along, and then it pounced in this direction, and then it twisted around and pounced again, and I thought, okay, if it was pouncing at a bird and the bird flew away, why did it twist around and pounce back? But there were no signs of mice tracks or even a little shrew, and it was wet sand, but the little claws should have shown. So there's no evidence of mouse or shrew. And I couldn't figure this out. And I was completely stumped. Which one was it? And I said, no, because I can't figure out the evidence. And I walked away, and I actually said to Steve, actually, this is a little bit of a mystery to me. So anyway, and the next morning, you wake up and you've got, aha, this is what it was. And this is a behavior that I myself didn't know of because I'm too lazy to read the books. Is that what had actually happened? You can see these footprints are actually very deep. So what had happened is that it pounced at a bird which flew up into the air, and then it didn't pounce again. It actually leapt straight up into the air to catch the bird in midair, and that's why the second pounce was very short, and the footprints was very deep because it was pushing into the ground when it went straight up. Now, at that point, I didn't know that caracals could do that. So it was a bit of at the time, it was a bit jarring. And then I remembered, but a colleague of mine witnessed a serval doing it. Now, the top spur is a serval, the more narrow one, which is much more agile and fast. And the bottom is the caracal, the front foot, hind foot. But I thought, from comparison with humans, like stocky humans are slower than slender humans. So, maybe if a serval can do it, it doesn't mean the caracal can do it. So I had to mentally create a new mental category to explain that maybe all cats can do that, have that very fast leap. So I literally had to construct a new mental models to explain that particular track, but the implication being is that I actually made a novel prediction about a behavior that I didn't know existed about caracals. And that is the essence of scientific prediction. like, for example, Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism predicted the existence of radio waves before we knew radio waves existed, and that allowed Hertz to build a radio to actually create and receive radio waves. And that's what makes science so incredible, is that we can actually predict the existence of phenomena that have never been observed before. This is actually a little diagram based on an explanation that Einstein did to explain how this works. So you have your evidence at the bottom. That J loop is the creation of a hypothesis, which is a non-logical process from which we can then deduce deductions and predict novel predictions. It's a very simple diagram, but that leap, that's a creative leap. It's a product of the human imagination. It's not, you don't discover a hypothesis, you create a hypothesis, and then you test it against nature. And then recently this video surfaced on YouTube, and unfortunately I couldn't trace the original author because it's one of these viral things, actually showing a caracal catching a bird in midair. And that's the strongest evidence that I have that the art of tracking is a creative, hypothetico-deductive, involves creative, hypothetico-deductive reasoning that is equivalent to that which is required for physics and mathematics. And that actually explains, by the way, a paradox in human evolution is that if we were hunter-gatherers and hunter-gatherers never did science, how come we can do physics and math? It's called Wallace's paradox, and that's where Wallace differed from Darwin. Is that how do we explain that the human mind can do science if science was invented by the Western culture? So what I'm saying, no, it's not. Scientific reasoning is an innate human ability that goes back to hunter-gatherers that evolved over 2 million years, and the implication really being that every one of us can do science. You don't have to go and do a PhD to become a scientist. Young children can engage in scientific activity. Just let them free and let them explore and let them do science. There's this beautiful paper published in the British journal, the Royal Society journal, by 8 to 10-year-old kids on bumblebee perception of patterns. These are school kids that published an original paper in a scientific journal. And that's by my book, The Origin of Science. You can download it for free off my website. It's a PDF. It's Creative Commons, so you don't have to pay for it. So this is Namkabe, who inspired my the creation of the Master Tracker certificate. This is back in '94 when I started the certification system, essentially because, particularly in the game ranging industry in the national parks, invariably your best trackers are non-literate or oralit. They don't have school certificates, so they get paid unskilled labor wages, whereas they're really the people who are the most skilled and who have the expertise. And the rangers, who in the old days were sort of like white rangers, handsome young men who can communicate and charm the clients, and they get the big tips and the trackers get nothing. So the certification system really was to readdress that imbalance in recognizing the skills for what they really are. That Wilson Masia is one of the best lion trackers. For our senior tracker certificate, you have to track down a lion and find it and not disturb it and back off. Over 20 years, I haven't lost a student yet. Wilson was actually one of the best lion trackers that I've known, a Shangaan tracker who used to smuggle people across Kruger Park from Mozambique. Joan Pinto, at that stage, a young ranger, he has now become a master tracker himself, and Lucas Matonsi is also now a master tracker. So basically, we've now created like the junior tracker certificate for children from 7 to 11 years old, the emphasis being on playfulness and just exploring and interpreting tracks, some easy tracks. They're not allowed to fail. It's really just to inspire an interest in tracking. Then adventure tracking for 12 years and plus, or even just visitors and tourists who just want to look at tracks and no standards at all. It's really just to stimulate an interest in tracking. And then you get the track and sign levels. The kudu is dedicated to the Kalahari San trackers, so only they will be issuing the kudu certificates in recognition of the fact that the indigenous knowledge in many ways are much more subtle than the trackers in other parts of the world. And in that way, also by having a distinctive certificate that they and they alone can issue, I'm hoping to attract trackers from all over the world to come and track with them, and that way we can revitalize the master tracker skills and pass it on to the younger generation, because now there's people all over the world who want to come and learn from them, and thereby creating the employment they need to sustain their master tracker skills. And then the master tracker, like the senior tracker, as I've said, you have to be able to track down a lion on foot. Master tracker is our sort of the top level, and there's sort of 5 categories going from traditional master tracker through to like Mark Albroch in the USA. He's got a PhD at University of California. He's got his senior certificate, and he started the tracker certification in the USA. So we've got 5 different categories to cater for the master tracker in the modern context. And these are the levels going up. So it's going from very informal playfulness through to the senior, the red, that's a very rigorous, and the master track at the top. I, as the initial evaluator, I'm the only one who doesn't have a certificate, because you can't give yourself a certificate. So I'm really just the facilitator of the process. So once there's enough master trackers, then I can do other stuff, because then I've made myself redundant. So this is sort of like level of detail. Like in Southern Africa, we've got about more than a dozen mongoose species, and even in soft sand, the senior tracker should be able to identify each one of these species by their footprints. And even the small cats. I don't know if you could see that, but there's like 3 little dots up there. Now those 3 dots is sufficient to tell you that that's only one species, that those dots can only be the claws of a honey badger. There's no animal that will leave 3 dots in that particular configuration. Like the porcupine is more of a broader spread of the claws. Or if you see that pattern, it can only be there's one slide missing. I don't know what happened to it. That's a porcupine. So only a porcupine have those proximal pads that have got that particular shape. And there's like leopard, male, female, front and hind. There's like an adult lion, young male, and a female lion. So you can tell male, female, youngsters, adults, etc. And unfortunately, in the process, starting from about the 1960s onwards, they started introducing horses and dogs. So the bow and arrow and persistence hunting started to... dogs are more efficient, so they abandoned the bow and arrow in favor of dogs. So that's one of the reasons why we started introducing the cyber tracker, which allows non-literate trackers to do. That's my old 1981 Land Cruiser. It's still going strong. And they're doing a survey of the Kalahari counting. And this is Karawa, the persistence hunter, teaching one of the youngsters how to use the computer. Like Karawa can complete, he can gather data, download the data onto a PC, check the data on a map, reload the batteries and make it ready for the next day's survey. So it's based on little icons, so even non-literate trackers can capture very, very complex data, just navigating through a series of screens. And then you've got GPS, and they can visualize. So the little yellow triangle there, you've got the icons down here. So they can actually read the data themselves. And this is another nice example of our project in the Congo, where through trackers in the forest, that's before Ebola, after Ebola. The red ones are carcasses that were infected by Ebola. So just by interpreting tracks and signs, we could work out a drop in the index of abundance. We could work out the number of gorillas that were decimated. About 80% were killed by Ebola in that area. And we could follow the spread of Ebola through the forest. Chimpanzees, duiker and bush pig, which was never known before. Like duiker is the only antelope that feed on carcasses where it picked up Ebola. It's also economically important, but people hunt and eat duiker. So that's a possible vector for getting Ebola. And in the early 2000 to 2003, there were about 5 epidemics, and at 2 of the cases, we could warn the health authorities weeks in advance before it got into human populations, just by monitoring wildlife populations. Unfortunately, that project had been closed down because the EC funding project came to an end. I mean, if we had this project in West Africa, it could have averted, the tragic loss of many lives, not to mention Africa-wide economic losses. And so we've got indigenous communities from Australia through to Canada and South America using the cyber tracker. We have it in America, that school kids have been using it for citizen science and school projects. This is in Central Park in New York, where you've got kids coming together and volunteers, and they're running around with their cyber trackers, counting species. And studying in day, like we've got in the Himalayas, snow leopard projects with local communities. That's the leopard toad in Noordhoek, where I live. And this is one of our first papers published, co-authored by two non-literate trackers in '99 on the feeding behavior of rhino, where a PhD rhino specialist would come into the Karoo Park to study rhino feeding behavior for 10 days once a year. And then Pocky, one of the non-literate master trackers, said, no, but that's nonsense because they feed on different plants in different seasons, depending on the rainy season or the dry season. So I said, okay, let's test your hypothesis. And that you can see the spread of the plant species from rainy through to the dry season. You can see they're completely incompatible. And that the PhD specialist completely missed out because he was just focused on 10 days per year. So that got published in the journal Pachyderm. And now more recently, this is our latest paper on the smartphone interface and its implications for inclusive citizen science. Now this is in the journal Biological Conservation, which is a high-impact journal, fairly conservative. This is a special edition on citizen science, which is not yet out. But this is actually the only paper published by non-professionals. All the other papers are published by professional scientists, and none of us, including myself, Justin is our software developer, and all the other trackers are non-literate. So this is actually the only academic paper on that particular edition of citizen science published by real citizen scientists as opposed to professional scientists. And in this way, I'm hoping to try and break down this prejudice against not just citizen scientists, but non-literate citizen scientists, and showing that, look, these guys can do real science. They don't need a PhD to publish a paper. And so I'm sort of trying to bridge the gap with a lot of researchers using our software, and a lot of those researchers are now becoming interested in becoming trackers and also working with trackers. So we're starting to bridge that gap between indigenous knowledge holders, professionals becoming trackers, and professional scientists on the other end, so that you have a continuous spectrum to try and not just democratize science itself, but to engage in and give recognition to indigenous trackers worldwide. And that's just an impression of all the projects that are using our software, which is downloadable for free. And hopefully, eventually, we've got tracker training centers throughout in North America and Europe and Southern Africa, but hopefully it'll start spreading as well. So my ultimate vision is that the cyber tracker, cyber being the software side, the tracker being the human skills, that we could revitalize indigenous tracking skills, and not just in the Central Kalahari, but revigorate and spread the skills worldwide again. My books are also for free. You can download a PDF of animal tracks if your kids want to look at animal tracks, or you can download the book on the art of tracking or the origin of science. And I struggled as a youngster to buy books. So I feel that scientific books should be free.
I would like to know, what is the youngest master tracker that you've got?
I think the youngest master tracker is roughly late 30s at the moment. Most of the master trackers have at least 30 years or more of experience. With modern resources, like what I have found, that when they start using the cyber tracker, it actually speeds up the learning curve. And also now with field guides and resources, like to give you an idea, in an indigenous hunter-gatherer context, to learn what the difference between a leopard track and a cheetah track, when you don't have books and you don't drive around in vehicles, you know that your father told you the cheetah's the one that runs down its prey and the leopard's the one that stalks its prey. So you have to find a kill site where the leopard tracks and then interpret the tracks and see this is the one that stalked the prey, therefore this is the leopard. Now, how does this footprint compare with the cheetah track I saw 3 years ago? You know, so it's a much greater challenge to become a master tracker in an oral tradition with no books or resources or computers. But now with the computers and the resources and more intensive assessments and so on, it actually speeds up the learning curve. So theoretically, it takes about 5 years minimum to get up to, usually 5 to 10 years to get up to senior tracker, and then from senior tracker at about 10 years to get up to master tracker level. For about 20 years, I've pretty much worked in isolation, but about 10, 15 years after my first book was published in 1990, I started getting citations. And I think from people who didn't actually know that I didn't have a degree. They just, because I get these emails to Dr. Liebenberg, and then I have to politely correct them and say, actually, you know, I don't have a degree. But then the main breakthrough came when I published a paper on persistence hunting in the journal Current Anthropology, which has now been quite widely cited. It's in the Born to Run book, and it's been cited more than 130 times in sports journals, anthropology journals, and so on. And on the basis of that, I was appointed as an associate at Harvard. But of course, now that I'm an associate at Harvard, they will once again assume I've got a PhD, so now they don't, so it doesn't sort of, you know. But yeah, it has taken 20 to 30 years in isolation to break into the mainstream, and I'm still a bit controversial. Even in the citizen science community, like the bird watching community, you've got the professional ornithologists, and the bird watchers are basically data slaves. You know, they've got these smartphones with very simple protocols, and they see a bird, they tuk, 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 and it's got to be verified and so on. But the birders aren't real scientists, you know. They call them citizen scientists, but they don't do real science. That's for the professionals to analyze the data. So even within the citizen science community, there's still this polarity between the professionals and the amateurs. So what I'm trying to do is to bridge that gap and say, look, that even oral-lit trackers and indigenous communities can actually do real science and publish academic papers. But it'll maybe be another 10, 20 years. But it's sort of breaking through slowly.
I'm curious about your life path that got you to this point from, you said you dropped out of grade 10. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got from there to this?
Well, basically, like when I was about 14, I wanted to become a theoretical physicist because I wanted to solve the energy problem. So at school, I never paid attention to my teachers and so on. So I was basically self-directed from a fairly early age. But then I had this sort of examination anxiety, and I just flunked out of varsity in second year. But at the same time, I always had this childhood fascination with tracking and the Kalahari and hunter-gatherers. It all looked like a big mystery. But having studied physics and philosophy of science, I got onto this hypothesis, this paradox of human evolution, is that how did we evolve the ability to do physics and math if that was invented by the Greeks, you know? And hunter-gatherers were not supposed to do science. So that's one of the most central paradoxes in human evolution. And so it took me 10 years of research to write my first 2 books on the art of tracking and the origin of science to have a rigorous enough field data as well as academic research to put together a theory that can substantively show, but even then there's still a lot of skepticism. But yeah, so it's really just a childhood fascination and a passion to just do my own thing.
What career opportunities are there for a child that, for instance, grew up on a farm and just loves animals, loves nature, wants to be out there tracking, white child? Would he be able to do these tracking courses? Would it open a career option for him? Because I know a child, for instance, that he's dropped out of school, and he's very frustrated, knows nowhere to go, can't actually do any type of matric or whatever. Is this a way for those children? Is this an option for those children?
I think the options are definitely opening up. I mean, at the most basic level, there's sort of game ranger jobs, there's field rangers, there's even trackers. But there's more and more interest in using tracking in scientific research, so working as research assistants and even then qualifying as academic researchers. So I do see a pathway from just being a field ranger to becoming an expert tracker, to becoming more engaged in citizen science, and then through online studies to actually qualify as a scientist and actually using your tracking skills to do scientific research. So I think that there's more and more options opening up. And certainly, I mean, when I was a youngster, those options didn't even exist. So it's all a question of how passionate you are about what you want to do and whether you can carve out your own.